Hi, I'm Emily from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to show you a really fun sewing hack. Even if you've been sewing for a while, you may be intimidated by V necklines. I know I totally am. So I've created this fun way to get a V neckline look without any of the fussy work. So the first thing you need to do is get any sewing pattern you like that has a crew neckline, which is your standard curved neckline, and from there we can create a pattern that has a fun V neck look. So here's my shirt pattern, the front piece, before I started. Okay, so let's pretend this is all put back together. And this is a raglan style sleeve, but you can also use your standard style sleeve as well. And the first thing you're gonna do is cut straight across the front about 1 inch below where the arm sleeve meets the side. Okay, so we cut that apart. So now we have our top yoke created, and this is going to allow us to overlap that front and create the easy V. The other thing we want to do is create a V neckline from our rounded neckline. So I went ahead and just from the shoulder seam point to where I cut across, you draw a diagonal line and then cut that piece apart. So now you're going to get rid of this piece. You're going to cut a right and left of this yoke, and you're going to cut on the fold the bottom part of the shirt. Now you want to make sure, because we've separated the pattern, that you go ahead and add an extra seam allowance to both the top and the bottom parts of these patterns so that when we sew it together, it's the right original size. The neckline can either be perfectly straight or slightly curved depending on how you feel the angle is going to work. I've cut both. This one I just felt like a little too extreme to cut it perfectly straight, so I rounded it slightly. And then, after you've cut out the rest of your shirt, you're gonna go ahead and assemble until we get to the neckline. So I've put the sleeves onto the back and onto our front top. Here's our front bottom piece that we're gonna add after we put in the neckline. So from there, we're gonna open up our neckline. Now, we don't have to really do any math or figuring, which is another easy part of this, and cut a long strip of neck binding fabric. You want to make sure on your binding that the stretch is going the long way, and I like to cut my neck binding about 1.5 inches to 1 3/4 inches wide, and then we folded it in half. So you can see it's open and then folded in half with the right sides out. And what we're going to do now is we're going to stretch and pin this along the open neckline. And you want to give about 10% stretch to your neckband as opposed to the flatness of your shirt. So as I'm putting this on, I am going to stretch it just slightly. You don't want to stretch it too much or it will pucker. If you don't stretch it enough, then you'll have a gaping neckline, and that's never a good look either. So we just stretch and pin, and you don't need a lot of pins because we're going to adjust this as we're sewing it onto the fabric. And depending on the stretch of your fabric as well will also depend on how much you need to stretch it. This pink fabric isn't overly stretchy. It's a two-way t-shirt knit, so really it only has a little bit of stretch side to side and not really much stretch at all up and down. So as I'm putting it on here, it doesn't have a lot of give or stretch anyway. But I've got extra fabric if I need it on both ends, and that's important. You want to make sure that you have at least 1 inch because that will help in the overlap. You don't need this long tail, but we're going to leave it for now. So now we're going to go over and use the serger to sew on the neckline. If you don't have a serger, you're just going to want to use a stretch stitch or a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. Okay, now the one thing you want to remember as you're sewing this is that the neckband is slightly smaller than the shirt, so you will have to stretch the shirt slightly to fit the band. And then of course remove the pins as you go. And so you can see with my right hand, I'm just slightly tugging on the shirt fabric, which will stretch that shirt fabric to match the length of the band. And if you want a wider neckline, you can always cut your band a little bit wider. I prefer a thinner looking band, but it is totally a personal preference. I find that the narrower the band, the easier it is to get it to lay nice and flat. And so that just makes it easier for me if I cut it a little narrower. So again, I'm stopping and starting as I'm lining up these layers of fabric. I have 3 layers of fabric that I'm sewing, 2 of the neckband and 1 of the shirt, and I am stretching the band slightly as I'm sewing it on the shirt. We want to try our best not to stretch out the shirt because that will stay stretched out even when we're finished. And as I'm going along here, I'm ending up needing a little bit more neckband, so I'm glad that I had that extra tail on the end. I'm adjusting my stretch to fit better. This pink is less stretchy than some other fabrics I've used, and so I had stretched it too tight to begin with. So I'm not cutting a large seam allowance, just going along the edge of the fabric, stretching my neckband slightly so that it's going to lay nice and flat when we're finished. Okay, so now you can open up your neckband and double check that you have sewn all the layers and don't have any holes in the fabric. And you can see how it's going to lay nice and flat when we're finished. All right, so now before we go back and put the bottom part of the shirt on, we're gonna top stitch the neckline to help it to lay flat. So now we're going to stitch on the main t-shirt part with the seam allowance towards the shirt. And I'm just going to pull the fabric to flatten it as we stitch. Sometimes when you're going over those shoulder seams, you have to make sure you give a little extra pull so it doesn't get stuck. But this just gives a nice stretchy top stitch to our shirt and will help everything to lay nicer. So I'm catching the seam that I sew the neckline on in this top stitching. All right, so we're working our way around the shirt. And the front of this foot has some little guides on it that show you where the needles are, and it's very helpful for stitching and keeping everything lined up. And then you can just stitch off the end. Then we're going to trim our threads. And now we're going to go back and finish the neckline. We are going to move on to the overlapping and the adding of the bottom part of the shirt. Okay, let me grab the scissors. Just clip these threads here. We want everything to lay nice and straight, and we can go ahead and trim our tail to about 1 inch. So from here, we're going to overlap these front parts of the shirt, and we want this bottom line to be straight again, okay? And then you can see how I've now created this fun V in the front of my shirt, and I didn't have to create any sort of interesting necklines or neck bands that took more work. And from here, so once you've got that pinned, with right sides together, we're going to pin on the bottom of the shirt. And you can either, start in the middle. Maybe I'll find the middle, start there, and then pin out to the sides. If we need to trim anything, we can do that later. But the reason we have these tails on here is because you can see they're going to be caught in this seam. So you need to make sure that you have a little bit of extra fabric on that neck band. And then we'll just line it up and pin it along here. And then we'll go back and sew this again. You can see on the dress behind me how I added an extra strip of fabric. It's kind of got a band above the gathering, and that's just because I didn't want the skirt to start quite so high up on the chest. I wanted to give a little more room before those ruffles and those gathers started. So you can play with this however you want. It's depending on if you're making, a shirt or a dress. But you can see how when we open this up, then we're going to have a nice looking top. And because I'm using the same color fabric, it's going to blend in really well. So let's go ahead and sew this on. And this is easy to sew on. The only part you have to be a little bit careful is when you get to that center and you are sewing across the V. You just want to make sure that everything remains lined up really well. So again, you're going to use the serger or any knit stitch to create this. Because of the fabric being stretchy, we need our seams to be stretchy as well. Okay, so as I get to the center, I'm just going to be a little bit more aware of keeping things lined up. Make sure you're cutting off or trimming the seam allowance that you added when you cut out the fabric. And I don't usually top stitch this seam, but if you wanted to, you could go ahead and do that as well. Okay, so now we can see that we have a really cute V neckline. Needs a little bit of pressing, but has great potential, and from there you could finish assembling your shirt. This is a great way to mix up any top or dress pattern, from a normal crew neckline to a fun V neckline.